The 29th of April, 1945. In a bunker 8 meters beneath the earth, yellow light flickered across weary faces. Adolf Hitler sat silently among his last few loyal aides, his hair graying, his left hand trembling intermittently. On the table lay a pistol, a cyanide capsule, a few scattered sheets of paper, and a gaze untouched by panic. No one spoke. Only he kept talking, kept believing, as if trying to carve his destiny into history with words. And then he declared, "If this war is lost, then the German people do not deserve to survive." It was not just a statement made in desperation. It was the final proclamation of a dictator who had gambled his entire nation on a dream that never came true. With no hope and no plan left, Hitler was no longer trying to save Germany. He was sentencing it to a kind of spiritual death. In his mind, victory was not just a goal. It was the very condition for existence. If Germany could not win, then the German people too were unworthy of life. From that moment on, Hitler's words in the bunker were no longer commands. They were bitter, cold deathbed confessions, spoken with the conviction of someone who still believed they were truths. And so, he kept speaking, as if each sentence were another brick, sealing the tomb of himself and of his empire. April 1945. Berlin lay buried in ash. From the east, over 2 million Soviet troops closed in on the capital. Heavy artillery pounded the city day and night, shaking concrete blocks, tearing through rows of buildings, shredding bunker entrances. 34 tank divisions and ISU-152 assault guns crushed the streets beneath them, pushing meter by meter into the heart of Berlin. Red flags had already begun to flutter atop rooftops near the Reichstag. From the west, British and American forces had crossed the Elbe River, capturing Magdeburg, Halle, and Leipzig. The entire Ruhr region, the industrial heart of Germany, had been erased from the map of resistance. German units retreated in chaos, their formations collapsing, supply lines severed. In the command bunker, the war map pinned to the wall of the Führerbunker shrank by the hour. What had once spanned all of Europe had now been reduced to a single dot: Berlin. Only a few years earlier, Hitler had stood before tens of thousands, proclaiming that the Third Reich would last 1,000 years. At the time, German troops swept through Poland, seized Paris, and laid siege to Leningrad. His empire cast its shadow across nearly the entire European continent. Now, the very cities once called Greater German territories were surrendering one after another. Generals quietly slipped away. The structure of power crumbled from within. Swastika banners drifted to the rubble-strewn ground. No reinforcements remained, no zones left to defend. Only the 8-meter-deep bunker underground where Adolf Hitler was spending the final days of his life. Inside the Führerbunker, everything took on the atmosphere of a final reckoning. Papers were gathered. Officers arranged for their families to evacuate. Those who remained were only the closest: Goebbels, Bormann, Hitler's personal physician, and 2 female secretaries. Hitler spent long hours in silence, lost in thought, or murmuring to his aides about final decisions. On the night of April 29, he summoned Traudl Junge, his loyal secretary, into the room. A small space, dim yellow light falling across his pale face. Hitler sat upright at the table, documents already laid out. His voice was calm as he said, "I declare that I will make my political testament." No one interrupted. Junge wrote, and Hitler spoke, without hesitation, without faltering. In every line, he repeated the obsessions that had haunted him for 2 decades: racial ideology, deep hatred, and an unshaken belief in his historic mission. He named the traitors. He appointed his successor. He ended with a cold, final declaration: "I choose death in Berlin. I will decide my own fate." Everything was ready for the end, and the Third Reich, once large enough to engulf an entire continent, had now shrunk to a silent underground room where Hitler's words no longer changed the course of history. They lingered only as the last echoes of a dying regime. After finishing the testament, Hitler sat motionless in a room barely a few meters wide. Yellow light lit his sunken face, his left hand twitching steadily on the armrest. No one spoke. The bunker was suspended in breath and sidelong glances. Outside, Soviet artillery struck at steady intervals, each shell landing like a ticking clock, counting down the final moments of a fading empire. From his office, the thundering blast sounded like a funeral drum for a shattered dream of conquest. Gone were the pounding boots, the rush of commands, the pulse of a war in motion. All that remained were the ruins of a power game approaching its final move. Those still in the bunker, Goebbels, Bormann, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, the two secretaries quietly withdrew into their own private silence. Each of them knew they were witnessing something irreversible. In that dense and suffocating stillness, Hitler suddenly spoke. His voice was not loud, but each word landed clearly. If this war is lost, then the German people do not deserve to survive. The words sliced through the room like a blade. They were not a reaction of desperation, but a conviction long held, a belief forged through years of war, speeches, and long nights writing in prison. That sentence was his most intimate declaration, the distilled essence of his worldview. To Hitler, the survival of a people was not determined by dignity or morality, but by the ability to conquer and to win. A nation deserved to live only if it could prove its strength, and if it lost in this war for existence, it had already forfeited its right to continue. That belief led him to decisions few could have imagined. He ordered the destruction of every remaining piece of infrastructure across Germany. Bridges, dams, factories, railroads, all were marked for demolition. In his eyes, if Berlin were to fall, then the country itself should vanish with it, leaving nothing behind for the weak to inherit. No reconstruction, no recovery, only ashes. That sentence was not merely an accusation, it was a verdict. Hitler placed himself in the role of judge, and the subject on trial was no longer the enemy outside, but the very people who had followed him for nearly 2 decades. In his view, they had failed to meet the standard of the master race. They had not fought to the end. They had retreated. They had surrendered. And in doing so, they had failed not just in battle, but in spirit. Inside the bunker, no one reacted. No one nodded. No one objected. They sat in silence, trapped in the heavy atmosphere of a judgment just spoken aloud. It was as if that sentence had turned the 8-meter-deep chamber beneath Berlin into a sunken courtroom, where the Führer delivered a death sentence to the very nation he once vowed to lead to glory. From that moment, all decisions inside the bunker shifted into funeral preparation. Hitler designated who would burn his body, who would carry out his final orders, who would escape with the testament. War maps were rolled up, resistance directives were filed away, last-minute counterattack plans were no longer discussed. Everyone began to prepare for the unspoken end that now loomed with painful clarity. The air inside the Führerbunker thickened after those final words. Hitler's office, containing only a low sofa, a small wooden desk, and scattered papers, resembled more a funeral chamber than the command center of an empire that once ruled the continent. Behind those thick walls, every movement, every glance, every whisper seemed measured and weighted, as if each remaining second had already been sealed in the record of history. Hitler was no longer a commander. He had become the central figure in a self-written tragedy. When his personal pilot, General Hans Bahr, came to see him, Hitler issued no further orders. Instead, he spoke plainly. "Bauer, I want to say goodbye. The time has come. My generals have betrayed me, my soldiers have stopped fighting, and I am no longer capable of continuing." When advised to escape Berlin by plane, to flee to Japan or South America, Hitler firmly refused. To him, the fate of Berlin and his own had become inseparable. He declared, "The war will end with the fall of Berlin, and I shall fall with it. A man must have the courage to face the consequences, and so today, I will end everything. I know that tomorrow millions will curse me, that is fate." In Hitler's eyes, his personal image had merged with the image of history. He saw himself as the central figure in an epic that had reached its final chapter, and as with every tragic ending, he chose death as the act that fit the role. To those who remained, Hitler entrusted his final tasks. In Bauer's account, he was instructed, "I assign you 2 duties, to ensure the cremation of my wife's body and mine. I have appointed Admiral Dönitz as my successor, and Bormann holds my crucial instructions to deliver to Dönitz. Bormann must get out of here. That is of the utmost importance." Hitler's final words to Bauer carried the weight of accusation and would be etched into history. "On my tombstone write, he was the victim of his own generals." These words confirmed that Hitler saw himself as abandoned the central figure in a grand betrayal. Yet, even that sense of betrayal did not shake his resolve. Everything had been prepared. 2 cyanide capsules were handed to the SS, one for Hitler, one for Eva Braun. Additional doses were distributed to the few remaining loyal followers. In that small room beneath the earth, the final act had been staged cold, absolute, and irreversible. Morning of the 30th of April, 1945. A chill crept through the thick concrete walls, seeping into every glance, every breath within the Führerbunker. Above them, Berlin burned under relentless Soviet artillery fire. Explosions echoed with steady rhythm, shaking the underground corridors like the death knell of a fallen empire. In the heavy air, reeking of gunpowder and dread, nurses, secretaries, and close aides quietly approached Hitler, requesting poison, their only means of choosing their own end. They knew exactly what was coming. Hitler asked no questions. He simply nodded, opened a small metal box of cyanide, and distributed the capsules with his own hand. When handing them to secretaries, Gerda Christian and Traudl Jung, he whispered gently, as if offering a farewell gift, "I'm sorry, I have no better parting gift for you." Then, with a voice laced in both bitterness and regret, he added, "I only wish my generals were as calm and courageous as you." No one said another word. Everyone returned to their seats, waiting for the appointed hour. The bunker sank into a long silence. At that moment, time seemed to stop. It was no longer a command post. It had become a waiting room for death. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun emerged from their private quarters and shared their final meal. There was no talk of war, no mention of the future. When the dishes were cleared, Hitler stood up, embraced Eva tightly, and whispered, "It's all over, farewell." Then the two returned to their room, closing the door behind them. At precisely 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot rang out sharp and final. Those outside instantly understood what had happened. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, along with several officers, rushed in. On the sofa, Hitler's head had slumped to the left, blood soaking the collar of his jacket. Beside him, Eva Braun lay on her side, her face untouched, the mark of death by cyanide unmistakable. The cremation plan was executed immediately. Under a rain of Soviet artillery, Goebbels and a few SS guards carried the bodies to a small garden behind the Reich Chancellery. The corpses were hastily placed in a shallow pit, doused with gasoline, and set alight. The flames rose among the ruins, a final ritual for the man who once dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich. On May 4th, the charred remains of Hitler were discovered by Soviet troops. Through forensic testing, his identity was confirmed. And at exactly 3:30 p.m., on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, the man who ignited the Second World War and orchestrated some of the most heinous crimes of the century, ended his life amid the ashes of the empire he had built and destroyed with his own hands. Hitler's death was the final act he could still control, an escape he had long prepared for, sealing a fate he had chosen for himself. Yet even before that moment, his last words left the deepest scar he would leave behind. "If this war is lost, then the German people do not deserve to survive." History has recorded millions of words, orders, and proclamations from Adolf Hitler, but this one sentence captured his worldview in full. In that vision, the right to exist was not tied to dignity or morality, it was tied to strength. Whoever remained strong had the right to survive. And in defeat, extinction became, to him, not only justifiable, but deserved. Not only for himself, but for the nation that had once exalted him as its savior. It can be said that Hitler did not choose suicide out of remorse. He took his own life to preserve his ideology. In his mind, death was the only way to avoid witnessing Germany's surrender, the only way not to face a world where his imprint no longer existed. That death was not an act of atonement. It was a predetermined conclusion, a ritual to close the chapter of a reign he believed was invincible. Looking back, what Hitler left behind was not a nation, an ideal, or a political legacy. He left the ashes of a ravaged Europe, millions of lives lost, and a world forced to redefine what it meant to be human. In his eyes, every value existed solely to serve his grand vision. And when that vision collapsed, there was no room left for hope, compassion, or reconciliation. That is why his death stirred no sympathy. He did not leave with an apology. He gave no sign of regret, only a final declaration that judged an entire nation by the outcome of war. From that, we see clearly, to Hitler, Germany had worth only in victory. In defeat, it was disposable. He did not die for his people. He died because they, in his view, no longer deserved him. And so it ended. A conclusion Hitler himself had scripted every word, every bullet, every vial of cyanide. Yet what remained was not the Third Reich, not a prophecy fulfilled of a 1,000-year empire. What endured was his own cold verdict, now turned back on himself, exposing the man who had dragged a continent into darkness. The world did not build statues of him. His name was not etched in honor. None of that was needed, because history recorded, in the clearest terms, a man who dreamed of ruling the world, in the end, was reduced to a sealed room beneath the earth, leaving behind a sentence of steel and a scar carved deep into the memory of humankind.